Vince Darrow, Preamble, A Journey into the Shadows of the 60s. Imagine for a moment that the calendar stops in the 60s. There are no social networks or screens illuminating your nights with a blue glow. Instead, the world moves to the rhythm of vacuum tube radios and black and white televisions that flicker like tired eyes in living rooms. It's an era where men wear fitted suits and women sport hairdos as tall as towers of Babel, and cigarette smoke hangs in the air like a permanent veil over conversations. Politically, the planet is a giant chessboard with two dominant players: the United States, with its dream of capitalist freedom, and the Soviet Union, a communist colossus spreading like a cold shadow over Eastern Europe. But don't forget that other piece on the board, lurking in the Far East, China, where the revolution of 1949 had crowned Mao Zedong as the supreme architect of a new order, a man who molded millions of souls with his vision of eternal communism. In 1961, while the Great Leap Forward devoured the country in a frenzy of collectivization, improvised factories in remote villages, fields emptying in the name of progress, ordinary people felt the weight of those decisions in their empty stomachs, and in the nights where hunger whispered doubts, they dared not speak. Mao, with his face omnipresent on sun-faded posters, represented for the Western world another crack in reality, a regime expanding like a red tide over Asia, an unstable ally with the Soviets, but forging its own path where collective ideals clashed with human realities, leaving echoes of forced loyalty and collective dreams that vanished into the dust of rural communes. The Cold War isn't just a name. It's a constant pulse in people's hearts, a subtle fear that seeps into nighttime dreams, where nuclear missiles lurk in hidden silos, spies move like ghosts through Berlin's streets, and in some distant corner of Beijing, the masses recite slogans promising a paradise that hasn't yet arrived. And beneath all of that lurk the deepest fear gnawing at the minds of families in their modest homes, that of a possible nuclear confrontation, an exchange of atomic fire that wouldn't just erase entire cities, but would mean the end of Earth as we knew it, leaving a planet poisoned by radiation, where survivors, if any remained, would crawl among smoldering ruins, wondering how their leaders had allowed ideological pride to devour everyone's future. It was a duel between two ideologies, capitalist and communist, where space became the new battlefield. Below, on Earth, tensions boiled. The failed Bay of Pigs invasion in Cuba in April, the raising of the Berlin Wall in August, dividing families and cities like a rusty knife. Vietnam was beginning to simmer on the horizon, a conflict that would devour souls and hopes. Ordinary people, like you or me, lived with that duality. The optimism of a bright future, with flying cars and stellar colonies in pulp magazines, contrasted with the earthly weight of racial segregation in the southern U.S., civil rights protests, and the distant echo of bombs in faraway lands. This is a science fiction novel recreated precisely in those years, born at that crossroads of the real and the imagined, and part of a parallel universe where the future is different and yet to come. In this supposed future, humanity has already taken that bold leap into space. Ships traverse the cosmic void. Explorers face the unknown not as a distant dream, but as a palpable reality. But don't forget that we start from there, from that fragile point where technology is still crude. Roaring rocket engines, room-sized computers, without microchips or GPS satellites guiding every step. It's a world where heroes aren't invincible supermen, but people like us, with doubts gnawing at their souls, memories weighing on their chests, and decisions made in the stillness of a pressurized cabin, gazing toward the stars that could be either their salvation or their grave. Prepare yourself, reader, to immerse yourself in this story. Leave behind today's digital clamor and feel the pulse of the 60s, a time of broken promises and infinite horizons, where the extraordinary is born from the ordinary. From here, in the pages that follow, the journey begins. Lances of fire tear through the Nevada desert night. The roar is so deep, it vibrates the bones in your chest. The STAR Comet rises on a column of white and orange flames, slow at first, as if hesitant to leave Earth, then with a fury that launches it towards the stars like a bullet fired by the hand of an angry god. On board, 4 men. The commander, Major Vince Darrow, United States Space Force. Captain Max Pike, the ship's second pilot. Captain Chuck Gates, propulsion and communications engineer. And finally, Dr. Tony Santini, mission doctor and scientist. The men who will take humanity to the moon or die trying. The plan is simple: lunar landing, flag, rock samples, triumphant return. 14 days of mission, broadcast live to a planet holding its breath. But as the STAR Comet approaches the lunar terminator, something fails. The remote controls from Nevada fields flicker, freeze, shut down. A strange, powerful, alien signal overrides everything. Chapter 1. In the heart of Nevada Field's main bunker, the constant hum of electronic systems, that living pulse that kept everything running, seemed like a distant echo of the nerves everyone carried inside, though no one would admit it out loud. Every check, every meticulous inspection, every calculation repeated to the point of nausea, was nothing more than a way to cling to something solid amid what felt like a leap into the void. The engineers, their faces illuminated by flickering screens, reviewed the circuits of the astro-electronic calculating brain, that beast of metal and wires, whose sole reason for existence was to adjust course if things went sideways up there. In the darkness, Automate B, that crude machine dedicated to launch, stage separation, and telemetry, passed its tests, like an old clock that keeps marking time without complaint. And Brain E, the coordinator that handled radar echoes and long-range infrared cameras, responded with its usual precision, its calculations matching down to the 10th decimal what the templates had predicted. The 3 main automatons, what people simply called launch and telemetry electronics, were declared ready by the chief engineer, a guy who'd been at this for years and who, deep down, wondered if he'd ever stop feeling that knot in his stomach before a launch. Everything was done with that routine sharp as a knife, the same one that had been repeated in thousands of previous launches. But there was a nuance, a slight tremor in the air that only a trained eye could catch. This time it wasn't just any rocket. It wasn't just metal and fuel. It was something that could change everything, or break it forever. The guards armed to the teeth at the north entrance saluted half-heartedly, as if they knew that in moments like this, formalities were beside the point. General Marcus Cobb, in command of Nevada Spaceport and head of Space Research Command, wasted no time on such nonsense. He cared more about knowing his men were alert, eyes open and minds focused, because a mistake down here could mean the end up there. At 018, just as they'd planned down to the second, Cobb entered the main control room. Behind him came Colonel Alan Bryce, his chief of staff, a man who always seemed to be balancing the world on his shoulders, and Professor Dr. Calvin Shaw, the project's scientific director, who had also headed the California Space Flight Academy since 1958. Shaw was one of those types who lived in their equations. But at that moment, he felt a tingle at the back of his neck, as if the weight of what they were about to do reminded him of his own youthful doubts, when he dreamed of the stars but feared he wasn't up to the task. Activity in the main control center didn't stop for their arrival. It continued its course, a swarm of low voices and pressed keys. Cobb was the center of it all, always had been, with his square build and that iron will that made him famous and feared among his subordinates, and notorious in the halls of Washington. He approached the large control screen. He rested his hands on the back of a swivel chair and stayed there, still, absorbing everything. Shaw, nervous, brought his rimless glasses to his mouth, a tic that always emerged when things got intense. In his mind, thoughts bubbled about what remained to be done. Not this last-minute inspection that seemed more like a ritual than a necessity. He looked at Bryce with a plea in his eyes, as if asking him to intervene. Bryce shrugged, subtle, as always. Wait, that's what the moment called for. Cobb had questions circling his head, though he knew more than most of the scientists there. It was his way, to brood in silence, remembering the old days at the military academy, when a mistake in an exercise could cost you your post, but nothing compared to this. Beautiful, impressive, and powerful, Cobb murmured in that measured voice he used when he wanted to sound casual, but his eyes remained fixed on the screen. Something in me keeps wondering if we're not pushing too hard. The Space Authority experts keep saying it's madness to launch from down here. It's not just about overcoming air resistance. There's also that extra velocity that would come free from the space station. Exactly 7.98 kilometers per second, or 25,400 kilometers per hour. The orbital velocity of the manned space station, sir, Shaw interjected hurriedly, adjusting his glasses. It's not decisive in our case. I insist on the enormous difficulties of assembling parts in a vacuum, without gravity. We've had bad experiences. It's much simpler to build a ship in terrestrial shipyards than 1,730 kilometers above the surface. The savings per unit exceed $350 million. That's what impressed Washington, Cobb scoffed with a touch of sarcasm that didn't hide his respect for the man. All right, I won't bother you anymore. Let's hope the brilliant test results justify today's effort. Professor, aboard that ship are my 4 best men. If something goes wrong, you'll hear about it. Shaw paled under that cold stare, feeling an echo of his own insecurities. Memories of sleepless nights calculating trajectories that could fail because of one misplaced decimal. Bryce The astute tactician who always navigated between the demands of science and military pressures, intervened with his particular skill for diffusing tension. "Sir, if I may, the press conference. The elite journalists must be biting their nails. I haven't given any details yet." "Does it have to be absolutely necessary, Bryce?" Cobb grumbled, rubbing his chin as if remembering past battles in boardrooms. "I have other things on my mind right now." "I would advise it, sir," Bryce replied with that flexibility that kept him afloat. The space medic, Dr. Ben Locke, cleared his throat, a sound that shattered the moment. Locke was responsible for space medicine, for ensuring those risk pilots were in perfect condition, nerves intact, and bodies ready for what was coming. Cobb suddenly smiled, a rare gesture for him. "Very well, then, let's do it, but via screen connection." Bryce blinked, surprised, but the technicians around them smiled to themselves. That was typical of the old Cobb. Unpredictable, but always one step ahead. "Sir, please, the people expect your presence in person. I promised them." "Then unpromise them," Cobb said without batting an eye. "Sir, they'll tear us apart in the editorials," Bryce pleaded, already imagining the headlines. "I'll lock them up until they calm down. We'll see. Turn on the connection." In the observation bunker, austere and charged with expectation, the speakers crackled to life. Cobb's head appeared on the screen. With his kindest smile, he wished them a very good day, remembering that it was past midnight local time. Then he turned serious, ignoring the journalists' long faces. Briefly and concisely, as if explaining how to bake a homemade cake, he announced, "Gentlemen, what you've seen on your screens for a few minutes is identical to an isolated rocket, but with individual cells that bring key innovations. The launch will be in about 3 hours. Final preparations are underway. The 4 risk pilots are sleeping deeply right now to preserve their nerves. We'll wake them only 2 hours before." The journalists remained impassive at first. Manned spaceflights were no longer news. Cobb's eyes narrowed slightly. He enjoyed having that card up his sleeve, and he played it all at once, knowing it would change the pace of everything. In the observation bunker, the air was thick with the smell of cold coffee and half-extinguished cigarettes, the kind of smell that clings to clothes and reminds you that no one has slept well in days. The journalists, crammed into their seats as if awaiting a trial verdict, stared at the screen with that mixture of hunger and skepticism that Cobb knew so well. He, from the control room, felt a slight tingle on the back of his neck. Not fear, not exactly, but the weight of knowing that what he was about to say could change how they saw the world, or at least how they saw it that morning. "The Space Research Command, after everything we've learned the hard way," Cobb said, with that deep voice that seemed to rumble from his chest like distant thunder, "has decided to set aside assembling the ship in orbit. The difficulties, the failures of the past, we all know them. They are etched in the memory of those of us who have been here from the beginning. So the first rocket to land on the moon will launch directly from this patch of desert. The ship is called STAR Comet." He paused, letting the name hang in the air, knowing that some of the older ones would remember nights spent debating names in smoke-filled rooms, while outside the desert wind howled like a lost dog. The commander of this first expedition to the lunar surface is Major Vince Darrow, risk pilot of the Space Force, 26 years old, astronaut and purebred nuclear physicist. His secondary field is atomic radiobiology. Darrow, well, he should be well known enough. He's the man who was the first from our Space Force to orbit the moon. The one who came back with that look in his eyes that tells you he's seen something the rest of us only dream of on the darkest nights. Cobb fell silent again, and from the other end of the connection came the outburst. Overlapping voices, chairs screeching, someone shouting affirmative, as if they had just won a bet they'd been waiting for years. The general felt a deep satisfaction, the kind not admitted out loud, seeing how his words had ignited that spark. "Thank you very much," he coughed, with a touch of irony that didn't hide his amusement. "You were a bit loud down there." "No, please, no questions now. My information officer will handle that after the launch. I'm only giving you the essentials, because my time is worth gold and yours, well, you'll see." The STAR Comet launches with a hand-picked team of 4 men. Besides Major Darrow, there are Captain Max Pike, Captain Chuck Gates, and Lieutenant Dr. Tony Santini. It's a military scientific team you don't find twice in a lifetime. Each of these risk pilots has diplomas from at least 2 complete university degrees in their pockets. They are complementary, like pieces of a puzzle that fit perfectly. They should all sound familiar. They are the best specialists from the Western world, coordinated down to how they breathe together. Space is already their second home. Photos and data will come from the information officer. Cobb glanced at his watch, feeling the tick-tock as a reminder that time waits for no one, not even a general with his reputation. Flashes of endless meetings in Washington passed through his mind. Nights when he had defended these men in front of bureaucrats who only saw numbers. "Please, gentlemen, your questions are useless now." He cut off the growing noise with that abruptness of his that made people fall silent instantly. "I'm giving you clear facts, period. The STAR Comet is equipped for 4 weeks of flight and lunar landing. The research program is mapped out to the millimeter. After the successful landings with automatic probes, today we're playing for real. God willing, there are no hitches. You know as well as I do that launching from the ground burns a hellish amount of energy, especially since the final stage has to land on the moon on its own and take off again from there. With conventional engines, it wouldn't have been possible. Not with a 3-stage ship of relatively compact size. Technical data, someone shouted from the back. With that excitement, Cobb recognized the scent of fresh blood in a story. The general shrugged, as if shedding a weight he'd been carrying for months. Total length of the ship, 91.6 meters. First stage, 36.5. Second, 24.7. And the third, the actual lunar ship, 30.4 meters. Weight at launch, fully fueled and with payload, 6,850 tons. Payload of the lunar ship, 64.2 tons. And yes, it seems barely larger than the usual supply ships. He paused, enjoying the expectant silence, remembering the heated arguments with the engineers. The night's Shaw had defended every decimal as if it were his firstborn. The reason is simple. Only the first stage still uses liquid chemical propellants. Stages 2 and 3 debut chemionuclear atomic jet propellants. That was the second bomb, dropped without fanfare, like someone commenting on the weather. Impassive, Cobb continued, feeling inside that mix of pride and weariness that comes with having pushed something so big against all odds. The first stage uses our best chemical mix, N-tripylborazane, based on borohydride. The oxidizer is conventional nitric acid, mixture ratio 1 to 4.9, self-destructive reaction. Thrust reaches 180% compared to the old hydrazine, under the same conditions. Cuts off combustion at 1,016 kilometers per hour, altitude 68 kilometers. Then it falls. The second stage starts with a new chemionuclear engine. Reactor temperature at 3,920 degrees Celsius. Thanks to our multi-compressed alloys, the plutonium microreactors fit perfectly. They release pure thermal energy to the working medium through exchange chambers. We use almost pure liquid parahydrogen as propellant. Once the evaporation problems were solved, and believe me, hydrogen boils at negative 252.78 degrees Celsius. It's ideal. Exhaust velocity, 10,102 meters per second. No chemical reaction can ever achieve that. Cobb let the silence settle, knowing he had given the essentials. What would be etched in those people's minds when they went home that night? You'll get more data later. This is the fundamental information. Gentlemen, the STAR Comet launches at 3. It will land near the Newcomb crater, right next to the lunar South Pole. At 1 o'clock sharp, just as the clock marked the change, like a heartbeat no one wanted to hear, Dr. Ben Locke stood before the 4 sleeping men. They had been submerged for 14 hours in that chemical sleep. Psychonarcotine doing its dirty work, keeping their minds blank so their bodies could truly rest. Locke stood there a second longer than necessary, with that unspoken pity that tightens your chest, watching as the antidote began to undo the knot. Thoughts returned, the mind lit up again, and with that came crashing down upon them everything they had tried to keep away. The weight of what was coming, the roar that awaited them, the certainty that once it started, there would be no turning back. A nervous pilot, without real sleep, body and mind in tatters, was no match for those cold machines that calculated everything to the millimeter, or for the engines that demanded the impossible. The mind had to be clear, because at the end of the day, only it could master it all. Only it. Locke waited with his medical team, guys who had been at this for years, and still felt that knot in their throats every time. Now came the usual tests, the ones that lasted a long hour. Pressure, pulse, reflexes, everything that confirmed they were still human and not just flesh ready for sacrifice. Afterwards, the last hour was for getting dressed, for squeezing into those suits that tightened around you like a reminder that space shows no mercy. Only 10 minutes before launch would they let them board the STAR Comet. Inside the command center, there was nothing left to do but concentrate, to exclude any thought that wasn't the course, the corrections, the next second. Anyway, with the ignition, everything would change. Then it would be life or death, the real test for the body and for what one carries inside. Then the hell would begin in the narrow belly of that beast of steel and plastic that roared as if it had a soul of its own. The 4 flat beds, with their foam mattresses that let air pass through like a final gesture of tenderness, were bathed in a soft, almost affectionate light. A brief gift for 4 men who very soon would have to endure the unimaginable. Major Vince Darrow opened his eyes. His awakening was instantaneous, as if he went from nothing to full alertness without any steps in between. That wakefulness that defined him and made the others look at him with a mixture of admiration and wariness. "Was I first?" he asked, more like someone confirming something he already knew. Locke felt a deep satisfaction, the kind you don't speak of, but that warms you from the inside. There was no doubt. Darrow was there, whole, exactly according to plan, son, he murmured. Calmly, taking a deep breath like someone preparing for the worst, Darrow sat up. Someone moved aside the breathable blanket. He was wearing a loose-fitting pajama set, the kind that doesn't cling to your body when you're lying down, preventing anything from pressing where it shouldn't. Darrow's quip, that dry joke about his calves, drew smiles from the men around him. It was like shedding a weight in that room that seemed too still, too unreal. "If I had calves like yours, Doc, I'd even want them looked at in a pinch," said Darrow, with that humor of his that cut like a clean knife. His light eyes shone, but his thin, almost gaunt face remained nearly expressionless, like a mask only he controlled. A deep gasp made Darrow turn his head. He watched with interest as his problem child, the one who, like him, had already orbited the moon, emerged from sleep. For Darrow, it remained almost absurd to imagine that giant with a broad jaw, baby-smooth skin, and hands like someone who's washed dishes all his life, squeezed into a capsule as narrow as a coffin. Captain Chuck Gates, specialist in astronomy and mathematics, with physics as a second field, awoke with a snort that seemed to come from his soul. "Has my son arrived yet?" were his first words, in that deep voice that filled the space. The launch seemed to matter less to him than that. "How is it, Doc? Did they take care of my wife?" Locke sighed, holding back what he really wanted to say. "Listen, son, if you see your wife as an unstable equation, that's not my fault. She still has 3 good months to go. If you ask me again before—" "It could have been already, right?" interrupted Gates, with that chubby, beardless face that suddenly seemed more vulnerable. "The unpredictable factors in a human body are in the millions. So I have to wait?" The third man announced his awakening with a soft laugh. The kind that calms effortlessly. Lieutenant Dr. Tony Santini, physician and geologist, was the most discreet of the group, the calmest, probably the one with the most self-control. He greeted without words, but his eyes were already on the clock. Santini followed that unwritten law of risk pilots to the letter. Don't talk about the launch unless it's strictly necessary. Sleep. Recover body and mind. Don't ruin the effect by thinking about the serious stuff too soon. It was simple. It worked. "Everything all right, Tony?" asked Darrow. "From what I see, that beard of yours wasn't even fazed by the drug." "Italian heritage," Santini nodded, with a touch of resignation. "What's with Pike? He sleeps as if nothing's wrong." Gates shifted on his cot. His huge hand fell with precision on the shoulder of the smallest one, that stocky man with a tendency to put on weight, who seemed like an indestructible rubber ball. His fat was a deception, a trap for those who didn't know him. Pike had withstood the 18 Gs in the centrifuge better than the nervous Santini. "Buzzing," he mumbled from the pillow. A wide, freckled face emerged from the pillowcase. Pale blue, almost colorless eyes blinked at Gates. "I've been awake for an hour," Pike said, as if it were nothing. "For a guy like me, the narcosis was too weak, obviously." "Obviously," Darrow nodded, serious. Under his gaze, Pike shrank a little. "I admire your patience. You must have breathed more shallowly than a mummy, so as not to disturb us." "He deserves a medal," interjected Gates, rolling his heavy body off the cot with a grunt. "The sufferers and the first-time fathers first. I wonder what's left to check on us." Gates fell abruptly silent, looking at Darrow with embarrassment. He had almost broken the law. Darrow let it pass. Yawning, with that indifference that fooled no one, he said, "Start with the baby. Doc, the circulation should be fine. But hold off on the neutralization injections for now." Darrow listened within himself. He felt that nagging unease in the depths of his subconscious, that fear you don't name, but is there, gnawing. The men's chatter was nothing but a trick, a way to calm themselves, to not think about what was coming. Don't talk about the launch, for God's sake. It would get ugly enough. He was sure of that. The ride on that roaring jet wouldn't be different from the words that described it. The real tensions were in the depths of the mind, barely controllable. One was afraid, naturally. No one would deny it. But these men could overcome it. That was all that mattered. Darrow observed, discreet but sharp. Everyone seemed fine. Perhaps Gates was a bit restless, thinking too much about the kid on the way. If it had been up to Darrow, he would have left him on the ground this time. But the team was a perfect gear. You couldn't remove one piece without breaking the whole thing. A stranger wouldn't fit. So he had resigned himself. Otherwise, he saw nothing to worry about. They were ready, or as ready as one could be. Chapter 2. The contour support beds were hydro-pneumatic marvels, the closest thing to a caress a machine could offer you at a moment like that. They adjusted to the body with a precision bordering on intimacy, compensating for every weight change instantly, as if they knew exactly where it hurt before you admitted it. More comfortable? Impossible. On the first manned flight, back in the days when everything was trial and error, they had forced the pilots. Big men, weighed down by those spacesuits that looked like portable coffins, to lie down with their helmets on, visors down, out of sheer safety paranoia. There had been injuries, of course, bruises that lasted for weeks, contusions that reminded you of every movement. The worst case, the one no one forgot, had been during the construction of the space station. A poorly fitted helmet, 11.3 Gs, and a neck broken like a dry twig. Vince Darrow had never launched in a spacesuit. It was his privilege, one he had fought for tooth and nail, and which he now extended to his team, like someone sharing a secret that could save their lives or kill them. The technicians still looked at him as if he were crazy. A minimal tear in the ship's skin, they said, and boom, explosive decompression. Blood boils in the veins, lungs collapse, all in seconds. But Darrow had flown enough times, had felt the vacuum brushing his skin through the cockpit, and he knew his ships didn't fail. Not like that. Not with him in command. So the four lay in their light blue uniforms, snug but lightweight, on those supports that seemed to embrace them. The spacesuits hung within reach, ready but not needed. Darrow had spared his men that slow agony, the pressure marks, the bruises that remind you you're alive, but about to break. The final checks had ended. Below, over 85 meters down, the last technicians withdrew like shadows, checking the first stage fins one more time. Max Pike, the engineer who lived for the atomic thrusters and electronics as a second love, had taken longer than anyone with his instruments. Darrow, with his usual calm, had finished earlier with the automatic launch and remote guidance system. It was his way, efficient, no frittles, like someone who knows time is a luxury you don't give away. The hands of the special clock jumped. 3 o'clock and 1 minute. The launch would be at 3 and 2 minutes. Not a second more, not one less. Darrow turned his head, a slow movement, because the foam support had already gripped him, adjusting like an invisible hand, and looked at the others. Everyone okay back there? Gates and Santini were behind the main supports, with nothing to do for the moment but wait. The cabin was a narrow nest, full of cables like veins, flexible pipes, and instrument boxes fitted with surgical precision, all made to measure, like a suit that fits you perfectly, but squeezes your soul. Below the central area, a tiny lounge with a toy kitchen and a bathroom that was little more than a functional hole. There was no space for more. 4 men at the sharp tip of a rocket. That was all they were granted. Below, the payload storage stowed with a precision that was painful to look at. And further down, well, further down was what no man wanted to step on if he could avoid it. Insulated tanks with liquid hydrogen, pumps, extra generator, then the thick wall of protective steel, the end of the zone where you could breathe easy. Behind it, the plutonium reactor roaring in silence, the transformer, and finally, that monstrous expansion chamber, with its pipes, coils, and cooling, where the vaporized hydrogen was forced to expand and push. The STAR Comet had 1 main nozzle and 4 small, steerable ones. Total thrust, 1,120 tons. Exhaust velocity, 10,102 meters per second. The answer to Darrow's question was a tense smile, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. Everyone heard the grating voice of the counter beginning the final minute. They had joked about it before, about that monotonous recitation that seemed eternal. They had heard it dozens of times in tests, and it had never bothered them too much. Now, it did. Now the idea of those atomic thrusters felt like a weight on the chest, a nightmare becoming real. 18, 17, 16, 15. Darrow brought the microphone to his lips, his eyes fixed on the indicators, those rotating panels hanging right above, as if watching him. Final message from STAR Comet to Central, he said, and his voice came out firm, echoing in all the speakers, right to the press bunker where people held their breath. All fine here. Signing off until first stage cutoff. Over. 3, 2, 1, 0. Ignition. Then the world fell apart, or so it seemed. A roar born in the beast's guts and rising like a wave, crushing them against the supports as the STAR Comet ascended, leaving Earth behind with a fury no man would ever forget. It was as always, though this time no one dared say it out loud. The STAR Comet's cabin was a perfect resonance chamber, a drum of steel and alloys that returned every heartbeat of the monster they carried below, as if hell itself were speaking inside their bones. First came the low, deep purr of the turbopumps, that rumble that seemed born in the very center of the earth and rose up the spine. Then the high-pitched, almost childish whistle of the pre-ignition. And suddenly, without transition, the roar, a scream not of this world, filling your head until you no longer knew where your skull ended and the rocket began. In the 42 subterranean chambers of the first stage, the N-triethylborazane met nitric acid and decided the night had to end right now. Tongues of white-blue fire swept the darkness, as if someone had opened a door to the sun. The pressure wave howled across the desert, slammed into the bunkers, made the journalists' teeth rattle as they shouted soundlessly, and kept roaring until it was lost in the distance. The STAR Comet rose with an accuracy that bordered on insulting. Not a millisecond early, not a millisecond late. But in that first second of slow, majestic ascent came the brutal pull, that savage tilting of the nose that made your heart jump into your throat. It was the moment when the beast still didn't know whether to obey or to flip over and devour its riders. Darrow felt the automatics fighting the thrust, how the gimbaled nozzles corrected the pitch in fractions of a second that felt like years. Below in the bunkers, no one spoke. Lips moved, hands gave short, nervous signals. Anyone not wearing sound-isolating headphones was lost, condemned to an absolute silence that would last for days. And then the STAR Comet decided it had played around enough. It gathered speed suddenly, like an animal finally recognizing its element. The jet of fire no longer fit in the exhaust trench. It lashed the launch platform, raised clouds of vaporized concrete, gave back to the sky what the sky had lent it. In the chambers, only a blinding white ball remained, rising straight, perfect, until it became a point of light that faded into the starry sky. On the large screen in the control center appeared the square face of General Marcus Cobb. He looked more tired than triumphant. The STAR Comet lifted off at exactly 3:02. He said with that calm of his that always sounded like a disguised order. All normal. You'll barely hear the crew transmissions due to interference. First stage separation shortly. Maximum acceleration, 9.8 Gs. In 3 minutes, we'll enter the space station's network. Then you'll see it clearly again. I remind you, no one leaves Nevada fields until the ship is safe and sound on the moon. This time, we have a surprise prepared. That is all. Cobb barely smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes, and cut the connection. 5 seconds to separation 1. A technical voice said from the loudspeakers. Function perfect, no deviations. 2, 1, contact. No one touched anything. No one breathed loudly. Only eyes watching, nerves vibrating, and 4 men up there who suddenly felt the most absolute silence they had ever known. 8 seconds of freefall. 8 seconds to remember they were still alive. Vince Darrow's voice came through, serene, almost bored, like someone commenting on the weather. A bit rough, but that was it. Darrow here, no deviation. Indicators normal, vibrations within tolerance. Crew ready for second stage ignition. Over. And then came the second hell. Pause. The pull was cleaner, more cruel. The howl of the atomic chemionuclear reactor seemed born inside each man's chest. Acceleration climbed to 8 Gs and stayed there, crushing them against the supports, as if an invisible giant had decided to sit on them. Darrow felt blood pooling in his back, his vision blurring, his breath turning into short, painful gasps. The circulatory agent was doing its job, but still, every heartbeat was a struggle. He looked at the indicators hanging right above his face, but he could barely see them. He only knew they were still green. 7 seconds of respite. 7 seconds when the world weighed what it should again. Darrow croaked his "all fine" into the microphone. He didn't hear the reply. He only saw the green light blinking, and then the second kick from the second stage. Within 3 seconds, they had exceeded escape velocity. At 20 kilometers per second, the reactor cut off. The separation was so sudden that weightlessness arrived like a hammer blow to the back of the neck. Darrow lost consciousness for an instant. When he opened his eyes, the red blinking was fading. He looked around. Pike was pale, but intact. Gates was breathing like bellows. Santini was already smiling, with that calm of his that always seemed out of place. They were in space. For real. 3,250 kilometers above Earth, hanging in free fall. With enough speed, in theory, to go to the end of the universe without ever igniting anything again. In theory. Because Earth's gravity was still there, pulling, reminding them it hadn't fully let go yet. And there were still many maneuvers left. The theoretical speed limits were just that, numbers on paper that sounded perfect in the smoke-filled meeting rooms in Washington. But up here, in the cold vacuum staring back, they became something to be tamed by hand. Second by second. Tiny deviations that, if not corrected in time, would send you drifting somewhere you'd never be found. Darrow's support bed folded with a hydro-pneumatic whisper, becoming a seat that embraced him like an old friend who knows you've been through hell. The instruments descended with him, hanging now in front of his eyes instead of above, as if the ship itself breathed a sigh of relief. It was a small relief, but at times like these, small reliefs counted for more than any medal. Max Pike recovered in his own way, letting loose a string of curses that would have made a Boston longshoreman blush on his worst day. Crude, direct words that came from that stocky body like steam from a pressure cooker. It was his way of saying he was still alive, that fear hadn't broken him. Chuck Gates coughed, a dry, rasping sound, and when he passed his hand over his mouth, a trace of crusty blood remained at the corners. "Rough ride," said Darrow, with that gravelly voice that came out as if he'd swallowed sand. "Rougher than they sold us. We hit 15.4 Gs in the final seconds. We cut through the radiation belts like a hot knife through butter. Gates, what's wrong, man?" Gates was pale. That healthy ruddiness he always wore like a flag had vanished, leaving only the unchanged sheen of his straw-blonde hair. He twisted his mouth into a grimace of pure frustration with himself. "Devil take me, but I should have stayed on the ground before doing this stupidity," he muttered. "I still had the tip of my tongue between my teeth at 7 Gs. Idiot me. They drill into us cadets, that's the first thing to avoid, and just me." He shrugged, his face contorted with pain that wasn't just physical. Darrow nodded, assessing him with that calm of his that sometimes seemed a mask, a smile that didn't reach the eyes but said, "I get it, brother. We all screw up sometimes." Pike's magnetic soles clanked dully against the metal floor. He wobbled a bit in the weightlessness, like a big bear trying to dance on a slippery floor. Without a word, with his boots sticking and releasing with each clumsy step, he covered the few meters to Santini. His "Doc, Santini" was brief, but loaded with relief when the other nodded. "He'll be okay," Santini said, concise as always. "He'll come around soon. Pulse like clockwork. Stick out your tongue, Gates. Come on." Gates opened his mouth. Dark red, almost black blood welled from the cut. This was Santini's territory. As Darrow turned the transceiver's volume regulator, making the chaos of confused sounds gradually clear, Santini's support hissed softly, transforming into a chair. Seconds later, he was next to Gates. They wasted no time on empty words. Santini knew Darrow expected his verdict, direct and unadorned. "We got lucky," said the doctor, with that calm voice that always seemed anchored to something solid. "I need to check more. 10 minutes, better 12. Is it doable?" "It's doable," Darrow replied. "Get started, Pike. Get the new values from the main automaton on tape. I want a correction calculation. We're delaying ignition 12 minutes. Give me the compensation. I think we can cover it with 4 seconds of full thrust." Moments later, his face appeared on the giant screens at Nevada Fields. General Cobb, standing before the microphone with a restlessness he couldn't quite hide, let out a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of the entire launch. "STAR Comet to Nevada Fields," Darrow said, strong and clear, cutting through the silence. "Gates has an injury, tongue bitten. Santini stopping hemorrhage, needs to heal quickly. Need 12-minute postponement. Over." Cobb sighed, looking at Professor Shaw with an expression that said it all. These kids always find a way to remind us they're human. Shaw gave a brief nod. It was possible. At Nevada Fields, they had always factored in the body betraying them at the worst moment. The large computer went to work. Seconds later, the corrected values were flying towards them via directional beam. Pike saw the diagram light up. The onboard automatics confirmed receipt. Entire plans, months of calculations, went to hell in an instant, replaced by new numbers rewriting destiny. The data went straight into the onboard memory. Darrow transmitted the routine stuff: radiation, magnetic field, temperatures, pressure, health. Things that sounded cold on the ground, but up here were the line between still breathing and becoming cosmic dust. Santini only needed 11 minutes. The cut on Gates's tongue was sealed, almost invisible. Gates looked around with that shame that eats you from the inside when you fail in front of your own. "Next time, use your thumb, baby," Darrow said, dryly but without malice. "It can take more." This 5th orbit around the moon had just begun. Over the visible face, the sun had risen for one of those lunar days that lasted weeks. The Terminator advanced slowly, like a lazy shadow, over the half-opposite Earth. The optical and relief radar painted a clear image of the broken, scarred surface. It didn't differ much from the known face, but they had known that for years. The moon no longer kept secrets in that sense. Not anymore. Then they emerged from the lunar shadow again. Altitude, just 90 kilometers. Speed reduced to 2.3 kilometers per second, with short braking impulses. The logging robot beeped loudly. The space station's directional beams had captured them again. The STAR Comet's central automatics received fresh instructions, the latest new calculations. Pike connected the separate evaluation. On the relief screen, the ship was a green dot, sliding precisely along the pre-calculated line. The endpoint was near the lunar equatorial pole, just behind the Newcomb crater. A red circle marked the spot. Fairly flat, rocky terrain, perfect for the large landing pads. As clear as the guidance impulses was the voice of the station chief. With the distance, there were pauses of several seconds between messages. Even radio needed time to cross the void. Still fast, resisting the moon's low gravity by sheer inertia, the STAR Comet passed over the western foothills of Mare Nubium. Ahead lay the large crater Walter. It wasn't far now. Birth control. General Cobb speaking. His voice came through with some interference. You will reach deviation point in 72 seconds. Impulse emission adjusted for radio delay. We are disconnecting to avoid interference. We have you clear on radar. Good reception. Primary remote control automatics activated. We'll set you down gently. Deploy landing legs. Request confirmation. I will not respond further until after landing. Good luck, and hang tight. Over. Darrow switched circuits. The 4 telescopic legs of the STAR Comet opened, pointing at a 45-degree angle away from the hull. Hydraulics pushed the long, braced tubes further and further out. At the ends, the 4 square-meter platforms unfolded like metallic flowers. Shortly after, they reached the contact point. The STAR Comet remained precisely on the flight line. Minor deviations corrected to the millimeter. Ready? Contact now, shouted Pike, his voice tense. They heard the heavy breathing of the others. This was the moment. Everything depended on this. Suddenly, without warning, the logs cut off. The impulse had arrived, precise to the millisecond. The engine roared. Short but brutal braking thrust. 5 Gs that made the reddish color of the hull seem to bleed. When it ended, and the calculated pause arrived, the men gasped as if they'd just surfaced from water. The next impulse would bring the 60-degree deviation, then the perfect vertical alignment of the nozzles towards the ground. Then, the ship had to be suspended right above the point, descending on a thin, gram-measured jet of gas. Descent speed, no more than 1 meter per second. That precise. The data flowed through Darrow's mind like a fast river. Everything had sounded so easy on the ground, so secure. Now, lying in this fragile shell, he felt in every bone the real difficulties, the ones no calculation could completely erase. The STAR Comet began to fall in a flat parabola. Lunar gravity was pulling strong now. It was time for the deviation. The nozzles had to look down, not horizontally. The ship fell flat like a plank, with no intention of correcting itself. 3 seconds. 2, 1, contact, shouted Pike. The contact came, yes, but with a howl and a whistle that sounded like it came from a 100-kilowatt radio station planted right next to the STAR Comet, as if someone had opened a door to pure chaos and let it in. The noises burst through the speakers like an avalanche, ultra-short beeps, strident rhythms that drilled into the brain, drowning out the men's gasps, their ragged breaths that sounded like they were struggling not to break. Max Pike stared for a second without understanding, his pale blue eyes wide open, and then, his wide, freckled face twisted into a grimace of pure, instinctive panic. The kind of expression that appears when the body knows something the mind hasn't processed yet. The green lamp above Vince Darrow lit up. It wasn't blinking, just glowing steady, constant, like a promise amidst the disaster. In the sudden silence, a sharp, hysterical laugh cut through like broken glass. Gates, Darrow's voice wasn't loud, but it cut clean, sharp as a knife that has seen too much blood. The sounds cut off abruptly. When Gates fell silent, his chest heaving like a broken bellows, the hard lines on Darrow's face softened a little. Something kind, almost paternal, appeared in those steel blue eyes, cold as steel, but capable of warmth when it mattered. "It's okay, Gates. Forget it." His gaze brushed the green lamp again. That glow was reassuring in a deep, internal way, like the beat of a heart you know is still working, even if everything else fails. With that, the onboard computer was saying clearly, the ship was upright, apparently intact, no serious damage. Pike showed a clumsy smile, the kind that appears when the logical mind still resists accepting what has happened, as if wanting to deny it for one more second. Santini remained silent, as always, his pale face animated only by those coal-black eyes that were tense, observing everything without missing a detail. Darrow gave the men the psychological shock they needed, because of course they were expecting something about the emergency landing, a comment, a sigh of relief, anything that acknowledged the madness of the last moments, the fear they had swallowed to avoid drowning in it. Darrow reacted differently. "Gates, you are to determine immediately the origin of that unknown control transmitter. The data is on the onboard computer's magnetic tapes. I want to see how good you are with mathematics when it really matters." That was it. He said no more. It wasn't needed. In the silence that followed, with the moon outside waiting silently and ancient, the men moved, because that's what they did. Move forward, even when the void stared back. The small, lively man, with a face that seemed not to have fully aged beneath an imposing baldness, that gave him an almost monastic air, was named Jeff Patterson. On the outside, you recognized him instantly by that sparse crown of golden blonde hair, interrupted by silver streaks at the temples, as if time had decided to mark him only there, on the edges, leaving the center intact. Patterson was one of those men who, in private life, felt a quiet joy in moving earthworms or bugs off the garden path, just so they wouldn't be stepped on. A simple, human gesture that said a lot about how he saw the world. Fragile, deserving of pity, even in the smallest things. But at work, or rather in the service, Patterson was something else. He was the man in the shadows, the one who pulled strings without anyone seeing the hands. The almost omnipotent chief of international defense. That intelligence organization NATO had created under the official name of the International Intelligence Agency. He answered only to the full NATO assembly and worked elbow to elbow with the national services. Those guys who lived with the phone glued to their ear and the constant fear of something slipping through their fingers. When he entered the large conference room on the 16th floor of the Space Department in Washington, accompanied by an older man who walked with the caution of someone who has seen too much. The low murmur of conversation died down, as if someone had turned down the world's volume. General Marcus Cobb, chief of the Space Forces, with that square, furrowed face that seemed to bear the weight of all the bad decisions of recent years, introduced him to those present. It was a secret meeting, the kind where words weigh more than deeds. Patterson was brief, concise as always. That tanned, almost childlike face beneath the domed forehead seemed kind, extremely pleasant, the sort that invites you to trust even though you know you shouldn't. He pointed to the pile of newspapers stacked in a corner of the long table, like a dirty reminder of what was going on out there. "Gentlemen, there's no need for us to keep circling this failure," he said, in that calm voice that brooked no reply. "I know, General, that you couldn't hold the reporters at Nevada Fields forever. In any case, solid complaints have come in, which Colonel Katz has skillfully deflected." The older man beside him nodded cautiously, a gesture that said, "I've done what I could." Katz was from the Federal Criminal Police, head of the Special Internal Defense Department. One of those guys who sleeps with one eye open and the other scanning the room. More concerning are certain reports in newspapers and those television investigations, Patterson continued, thoughtful, as if recalling something that pained him personally. "According to them, your STAR Comet is not only missing, but has crashed completely. They give details so precise, one wonders how much truth is in it. And what troubles me more is the source of that information. All this is just so you know. We've deployed our antennas as always." Patterson glanced at his watch, a subtle gesture that said time is pressing and we're losing. Now, the STAR Comet has been missing for over 24 hours. Let's stick to the term that still leaves room for hope. I'm interested in your opinion about those editorials in leading newspapers that categorically state an emergency call from the ship was intercepted. Signal QRRQ, which according to the Space Force code means attack, planned remote control interference, and onset of an accident. If that is true, I want details. More details. Patterson nodded kindly to the room, like a professor who has just asked a question he knows will hurt to answer, and sat down. General Cobb rose wearily, his face seeming more sunken than ever, furrowed by lines that hadn't been there a few days ago. His voice came out brittle, as if every word cost him. "You are right, sir," said Cobb, rubbing the back of his neck, as if trying to erase an old pain. QRRQ is exactly that. It's a mystery how some journalists access the code. I've put our security service to work on it. No results, for now. On the other hand, their interception of the short signal isn't that surprising. Some large stations had it tuned in the south polar region of the moon. We requested support from the major observatories. Something could have leaked there, of course, but that doesn't explain how they know the meaning of QRRQ. Nothing more can be said about that. There was a good reason why Vince Darrow had climbed that annular wall of accumulated rubble, and it wasn't just to feel the light weight of his body under lunar gravity, which made him move as if in a dream where Earth's rules no longer applied. Up there, the landscape stretched out like a forgotten desert, full of craters that looked like ancient scars. But nothing jumped out that didn't belong to that dead place. The STAR Comet and the pressurized tent, with their silvery sheen reflecting the stars like a broken mirror, were obvious intruders. But to Darrow they were now part of the scenery. They had earned their place through sweat and endless calculations. A subtle smile played on his lips, the kind that only appeared when his logical mind bumped against something deeper, more human. He wondered, with that self-restraint that defined him as a man who had learned to measure every thought like a step into the void, by what right he allowed himself to claim that those things belonged there. He concluded it was pure earthly arrogance, the kind of illusion men tell themselves to keep from going mad. What you conquer with effort, you make your own, even if the universe disagrees. The STAR Comet belonged to the landscape because they had brought it. Period. Darrow let out a soft, low laugh, the kind that escapes when you catch yourself in a philosophical folly in the middle of nowhere. Immediately, the speaker in his spherical helmet crackled, and a voice with a touch of unease he knew well sounded inside his head. "What's up?" it asked. "Hey, Vince, what's going on? Trouble?" Darrow smiled to himself, squinting as he reflected on how that voice always carried a hint of concern, as if Pike was remembering the times things had gone wrong in past training sessions, in pressurized cabins where a mistake meant the end. "No," he replied calmly. "But answer, what's up?" insisted Pike, louder now. Of course he had heard the laugh over the open intercom, that invisible thread keeping them connected in the lunar silence. "I allowed myself a laugh," Darrow said into the tiny microphone, adjusting his tone to sound casual, though deep down he knew every word counted in a place where air didn't exist. "If you don't mind." A hoarse curse followed, then a cough that sounded more like a disguised grunt. "He's standing in a lunar crater, alone and laughing," said Pike, with that feigned indignation he always used to hide his own nervousness. "Did you hear that, Gates? He's up there laughing." "At least something," came Gates's grumpy voice through the system, with that accent that dragged words as if he were thinking of something distant, perhaps his family, or the nights when everything seemed simpler. "I've been trying for half an hour to scratch my back that itches like hell, if possible with all 10 fingers. No way, friend. Right where I want to reach, those 3 damned oxygen baubles are hanging." Pike let out a guffaw that rumbled in the helmet. Darrow turned the volume control a little to the left. The redhead's voice could wake the dead, or at least make the helmet vibrate like a drum. "Hey, Vince, how's the air up there?" he boomed again. "There's a storm," Darrow replied dryly, savoring the moment of confusion he knew would come. Pike fell silent, perplexed, as if running through all the lunar weather reports they had studied in his mind, looking for something he'd missed. "Because on the moon, the air is so heavily charged," Darrow added softly, letting the irony seep through like a memory of nighttime chats at the base, where humor was the only thing keeping sanity intact. "Aha, Roger, Commander. That's something one has to know." "Exactly what I mean. And since I make an effort in principle to use correct terminology even on the moon, I won't talk now of a straight line of air, but of a direct line of sight. All right? So, my friend, at what approximate distance am I from you in direct line of sight?" 852 meters, came Santini's voice, with that amused tone that always seemed to emerge when things got technical, as if you were recalling his days at university, measuring samples under a microscope. "Because I'm sitting at the tactical radar, with which I measured you to a centimeter's precision. Handy, right?" "More than that," Darrow laughed, feeling a brief warmth in his chest, that invisible bond uniting them beyond the mission. All right, Pike, here's a task. I just ask that it be executed as cleanly and exactly. Take a new gauge, set the reflex sight to 10 magnification, distance 850 meters, and fire half a magazine at the big boulder that looks like a giant's head, approximately 20 meters to my left. Understood? It was a clear order, no frills, the kind Darrow gave when his mind was already 3 steps ahead, calculating risks like equations on a blackboard. He wasn't a fan of long explanations. Life in space taught you to be direct. Understood? Pike confirmed tersely, with that efficiency that made him the best partner in tight spots. May I ask what the jokes are about? I rarely joke about serious matters. I want to know how the miniature rocket projectiles perform. I'm primarily interested in impact force and explosive power. Start and pay close attention to how the recoil behaves under local gravity conditions. Absolutely no recoil, Pike stated calmly, as if reciting a manual he'd memorized on sleepless nights. Each projectile has its own propellant charge, according to rocket principle. No cartridge cases. The projectile and the primer part ways amicably. Muzzle velocity 240 meters per second. There can't be any recoil, a precise and safe shot. I've been thoroughly briefed. Handy. Darrow mocked, with that dry sarcasm that surfaced when he wanted to lighten the weight of what was coming. Start and don't mix me up with the boulder. Pike let out a short, sharp laugh, the kind that shatters tension like a hammer on glass. Gates watched in silence as Pike picked up the heavy weapon from the floor, that thing with a short stock and thick barrel that looked like it came from a workshop where engineers dreamed of efficient destruction. Darrow had been clear. No one left the STAR Comet without a weapon, as if his instinct told him the moon wasn't as empty as it seemed. Max Pike planted himself in front of the half-assembled pressurized tent. About 30 meters away, the STAR Comet towered into the lunar sky like an accusing finger. Carefully, he adjusted the reflex sight to 10 magnification, distance 850 meters. The red mark for the electrical ignition of the propellant lit up. The first projectile slid into the chamber. These new cartridges had a small caliber, 6 millimeters, long as a finger, but their explosive power promised to be brutal. Pike hesitated for an instant, the distant target in the illuminated sight, zooming closer, as if the moon itself were bringing it. Go ahead, Darrow said demandingly, his voice a reminder that time didn't wait. What are you waiting for? Imagine that interference transmitter is the one that screwed up our remote control. Well, Pike cursed aloud, feeling that internal click when the piece fit. The experiment was no longer a whim. It had sense, depth, like everything Darrow touched. The idea of a game evaporated, leaving only the weight of the real. For the first 10 rounds, I'll switch to single fire, with your permission, he declared tersely. First, let's see how I do with the syringe. Agreed. Begin. Pike brought the stock to his shoulder. The boulder loomed large in the sight. Pike thought the distance was nothing for these projectiles, fast as thought. He barely needed to raise the sight. With the moon's low gravity, the trajectory would be almost straight. The sight was made for that. He could have fired for kilometers and still hit. Gates held his breath as Pike touched the contact. There was no noise. On Earth, it would have been a sharp whistle and a bang that left you deaf. Here the shot was a ghostly silence, as if the universe refused to acknowledge it. Only bright flames shot from the oval openings of the short barrel. They went out instantly. It seemed nothing had happened. Pike was bewildered, his heart beating hard in his airless chest. "Notice anything?" he asked breathlessly. "Damn, one has to get used to this weird way of shooting. I felt nothing." "But I did," came Darrow's dry reply. "Stone chips flew all the way here. The projectile was already here before you pulled the trigger. Incredibly fast. The boulder has a hole 30 centimeters wide and is deep. Quite something. That's a grenade. Try a long burst. The weapon fires accurately." Pike switched to continuous. The projectile exhaust flames dazzled him. From where Darrow observed, a bright whitish trail was visible, the solid propellants of those little demons. When they penetrated the darkness under the slope, they created a line of incandescent fire. The magazine was empty before Pike realized it. Little remained of the boulder. The lifted chips fell slowly, as in a dream where time stretches. Darrow had followed the silent explosions. Only flashes and flying rock. No shockwaves traveling through the vacuum. "That's enough," he declared in a tense voice. The one that came out when his mind was already calculating the next move. "The equipment department gave us a nice toy, gotta admit. How long did you hold the trigger, Pike?" "Maybe 2 seconds," Pike replied, astonished, feeling a new respect for that weapon that seemed from a mad workshop. "But the magazine is empty. Friend, 90 rounds in that instant." "Exactly. Rate of fire is 50 rounds per second. All right, experiment concluded. I'm coming down. Santini, how far along are you with the food?" "You could come. I've made an effort." Vince Darrow looked around one more time, absorbing the landscape as if searching for something his instinct told him was there, waiting. Then he slid down, long leaps covering crevices and uneven rocks with ease, like a man who had spent hours in simulators where gravity was just an adjustable number. 20 minutes later, he appeared in front of the pressurized tent. The airlock was mounted, the conditioner connected to the large unit of the STAR Comet. Filling it cost several liters of liquid oxygen, explained Gates, with that voice that always carried a hint of practical concern, as if he were remembering budgets and supply lists. "Is it worth spending valuable gas like that? I wonder if we won't need it for controlling the STAR Comet. Our supply is limited." Darrow stopped in front of him, standing tall, measuring the taller man by a few centimeters, with that gaze that weighed without judging. Gates out-tallied him, but in moments like this, it was Darrow who filled the space. "Gates, you're worrying about nothing. Repairing the landing strut needs skill and freedom of movement. I don't want to be wrapped in a spacesuit hammering molybdenum steel. And I also don't want to stand out in this yawning vacuum." Gates blinked towards the dark, improbably starry sky, as if imagining the weight of all that falling on them. "Just saying," he murmured, and a disheartened smile appeared on his lips, the kind that surfaced when he realized his doubts were more personal than practical. "You've been thinking about your return to Earth, haven't you?" Darrow asked calmly, without accusation, just acknowledging what everyone felt deep down. "About the baby, or no?" Gates pressed his lips together, the silence saying more than words. All right, we understand. But you shouldn't dwell on it so much. Our planning is solid. We've chewed it to the bone. We won't make a reconnaissance flight until the STAR Comet is in perfect condition. We can't risk a short takeoff with subsequent landing beyond the pole. The damaged telescopic strut wouldn't hold it. Sure, we could climb a few kilometers and, with a short maneuver, get into direct line of sight with Earth. But then we'd have to land again. In that case, the STAR Comet could suffer damage so severe we couldn't fix it with what we have on board. In that situation, I would ask myself if spending oxygen on the tent is a luxury. Now we know. Clear? Darrow smiled impassively. That mask he used to maintain balance. Gates kept staring into space, as if seeking answers in the stars. Clear. Totally clear, he repeated, nodding, though his voice carried an echo of doubt. But another question is bugging me. Wouldn't it be better to launch now for the return? We made an emergency landing, right? Why bother repairing the strut? The landing on Earth is done with thrust. We'll land on the landing gear. Doesn't matter if a leg breaks on touchdown. We'll get down anyway. His gaze lowered, his eyes blinking, as if seeing something he didn't want to see. Darrow didn't lose patience, nor clarity. Only his tone became a bit sharper, barely perceptible, like a knife sharpening just enough. Gates, your idea is feasible, but it brings an unnecessary risk. Let me put it this way. We have a task here, and a cracked leg isn't going to tempt me to launch. Besides, his face became inscrutable, as if recalling a bad dream. Besides, I have this uneasy feeling we didn't end up here by chance. There's something to clarify first. Gates reacted instantly, his blue eyes apologizing without words. Pike started to smile. The matter seemed settled, as if the weight in the air had lightened a bit. All right, forget my words. Gates coughed, the burly man rubbing the back of his neck. It was just an idea. After eating, we'll look for the interference transmitter. I have the basic data. I'll feed it into the electronics later. I'm curious, Darrow nodded. All right, let's see what our doctor prepared. A disgruntled snort was heard in the helmets. Santini explained neatly why the culinary art, so simple for masters, was basically a domain of chemical processes. It sounded logical, but something didn't quite fit, as if he were trying to convince himself more than them. Darrow stopped in front of the landing zone, still warm, from residual radiation under the STAR Comet's thrusters. Ahead hung the wide mesh basket of the extended winch. The long arm of the crane emerged from the open hatch of the cargo hold, right below the cabin. Darrow had avoided the folding rungs along the hull. For that, they would have had to pass under the separated legs, near the thruster, still emitting a subtle radioactive hum. Someone will have to forego the high jump for now, Darrow declared, with a forced smile. The kind that surfaced when he wanted to lighten up, but his mind was already on the next thing. His eyes sought the faces of the two men. Ah, Pike, be so kind as to stand guard outside for a while. I'll relieve you in half an hour. Up there on the slope is a good spot. Good visibility. We stay in contact by radio. Max Pike said nothing. Darrow's grave voice had told him enough. However calm the commander seemed on the outside, something was stirring within, an instinct that wouldn't be quieted. Before Pike left with his weapon ready, Darrow said in a drawn-out tone, "One question. Are you still thinking about that info that a manned rocket from the Asian Federation launched just before us?" "Caught it," Darrow confirmed, his eyebrows raised slightly. It could be that someone wants to verify our accident in person. In my opinion, the interference transmitter is near the polar region, so keep your eyes open. Our automatic radio goniometer scans all wavelengths. If we hear weird tones, something changes here. He looked around with feigned boredom, as if checking the weather on a normal day. Up in the STAR Comet's cabin, Santini felt a sudden chill. He suddenly felt uncomfortable, exposed. He was the kind who took risks for science, but unexpected complications like this threw him off. Troubled by heavy thoughts, he listened to the whir of the crane motor. Darrow and Gates reached the cabin. On the lit screens, Pike's diminishing figure could be seen. Finally, he disappeared into the darkness of an outcrop sheltered from the sun. Moments later, a hiss was heard in the airlock. Pressure equalized. When they entered, Santini showed a somewhat tense smile, as if trying to convince himself everything was under control. "Hello," he said weakly. "Nothing on the radio goniometer, just your chatter." Darrow took off his spacesuit, feeling the relief of the fabric against his skin. Gates' face was drenched in sweat. With groans of pleasure, he rubbed his itchy back against a wall strut. "Oh yes," he sighed. "This is like paradise on Earth." "On Earth, they'll have written us off as missing," Santini said quietly, as if the words escaped him unintentionally. Gates's groans stopped abruptly. "They will," Darrow confirmed calmly. "They will, but not for long. You have my word. After eating, we start with disassembling the leg strut." Santini thought of his wife, of the quiet nights that seemed from another world now. Gates of the baby, of how time ran differently down there. No one said it, but everyone knew it. It was a situation that needed a firm hand and an iron will. Darrow had both, and something more. That ability to see the entire process, step by step, without being carried away by the fear gnawing in the background, and perform the necessary switching. It only took him 5 days to repair the broken landing strut. 5 days in which the lunar silence seeped under the skin like a memory you don't want but can't shake. Another 24 hours were enough to assemble and load the lunar armored vehicle, that tracked tank that seemed from a workshop where engineers had dreamed of conquering dead worlds. After a deep sleep, induced by pills that blurred the edges of exhaustion and left the mind clean like a freshly wiped blackboard, Vince Darrow and Max Pike set off. The vehicle had been tested on terrain that would have made any Earth machine weep. It knew no obstacle it couldn't bite through and spit out. Every bolt had been checked by men who lived for that. Guys with tired eyes and hands that knew more about metal than people. It was an unarmed transport, all-terrain, with a spacious cabin for 4 and a plastic steel dome that darkened when the sun beat down too hard. In the cargo area behind, they only carried tools and spare parts. Darrow wasn't here for scientific investigations on this trip. First, survive. Second, contact Earth. The vehicle's transmitter could pull with the reactor's full power. 12 kilowatts were enough to shout all the way to Nevada fields, no problem. They had been rolling for 24 hours when the sun truly began to set, a sickle receding as if it too were in a hurry to leave. They weren't far from the pole. With that would come the direct line of sight with Earth. They were in their suits, but with the helmets retracted over their shoulders. The pressurized dome was as safe as the STAR Comet's cabin. That special plastic would only yield to a force no one on Earth had yet achieved. Max Pike squinted his pale blue eyes forward. The jagged peaks rising like rusty blades set his nerves on edge. Leibniz Mountains, for sure, he said, his voice tense, as if pronouncing the name could summon them. Hold on. Darrow cut the power. The hum of the electric motors died, leaving a silence heavier than any noise. The generator idled down inside its radiation shielding. Darrow wiped the back of his hand across his forehead, removing sweat that shouldn't be there inside a refrigerated suit. Without a word, he took out his sunglasses and cleaned the dark lenses. The ultraviolet light was starting to really hurt. He looked at the mountains. The tip of his tongue touched his chapped lips. Just 8 more kilometers. Who'd have thought you could almost touch them? We're in Huseman Crater, still hidden from Earth. Another 15 and we pass the pole. But not this way. We have to veer left, east, or we'll dive headfirst into the Leibniz foothills. That won't be a picnic. Pike's dirty finger jabbed the map. In the full light, his broad face looked more sunken than ever. The freckles like rust spots on old sheet metal. The trip was too long for any man not named Vince Darrow. For him, it was almost a joke. If they could have gone straight, they'd have been there long ago. But they had to skirt plateaus and canyons, as if the moon itself wanted them to suffer. On the map, the route looked like a drunkard's scribble. Darrow cleared his throat and passed him the water bottle without looking. We turn. Leibniz is a mess. I don't want to get into those canyons. We're on the eastern part. The main massif is to the west. We'll pass clean. Pike drank as if the bottle were the only thing anchoring him to reality. The silence in the cabin grew dense, and Darrow covered it with more reflective foil. The sun hammered down. Getting rid of the heat was the real problem in this airless oven. Finally, Pike spoke, somberly, as if the words weighed on his tongue. Something's gonna happen. My neck itches. Something has to happen. Look at this. He hit the map again. The new course passed right through a circle Chuck Gates had drawn with a red marker the night before. Aha, I know, said Darrow, stretching the syllable like someone stretching a rubber band almost to breaking. A smile that didn't reach his eyes formed on his lips. Pike stared at him. The lips were chapped, split in several places. We should skirt that point with a wide curve and first make sure the message gets to Earth. Then we see. What do you think? Darrow looked forward for a long second, as if seeing something Pike couldn't. Then, Pike saw a face, where the lines seemed carved with a knife. Darrow's eyes shone with that cold, steely blue hardness that emerged when there was no room left for doubt. Problems are there to be solved. Pike. Circling them doesn't do us a damn bit of good. We have to approach, like it or not. I prefer a quick, clean operation. I want to see who's faster. They also suffer the cold, the vacuum, and the radiation. Probably more than us. We're damned heroes, yeah? Grumbled Pike. Fine. From now on, I'll take care of the infrared sensor. At the slightest beep, you drive like the devil himself is chasing you. His hands instinctively sought the weapon. They now carried the heavy automatics, based on the same principle as the big machine guns, but in a portable version. Darrow engaged the gears. The engines roared, and the tank started moving. They skirted the crater wall and came out onto a wide plain of rubble. Dust rose in columns behind the tracks and fell almost instantly, with no air to hold it up. 6 seconds later, the sun appeared whole. The lunar curvature made everything happen fast. They crossed the line of direct sight without incident. And there was Earth, a huge, almost full crescent, hanging low over the northern horizon, like a promise that hurt to look at. They didn't talk much. Fatigue had carved grooves in their faces. The maneuvers were quick, almost nervous. Both felt the same. It was now or never. Darrow deployed the parabolic dish. Pike connected the reactor at full power. The transmitter reported ready, while Darrow aligned the antenna. Earth sat right in the center of the automatic sight. Darrow swiveled the seat awkwardly, as if he struggled to remember how to do something so simple. In front of him, the indicators trembled, all in order. He brought the microphone close. "Ready?" Pike asked hoarsely, the heavy weapon gripped in his hands like a rosary. Darrow nodded. He turned on transmission. In the speaker, only the normal noise of space could be heard, that distant whisper of stars that never sleep. A barely perceptible smile touched his lips. Then he spoke, calm, precise. "Major Vince Darrow, commander of the STAR Comet, calling Earth Control Nevada Fields. Repeat, Major Vince Darrow, commander of the..." It came suddenly, like a hammer falling from a cloudless sky. The green transmission pilot light intensified into a blinding glare that bathed the cabin in a sickly, ghostly hue. Directly above them, a few meters away, the antenna burst into intensely fluorescent green flames. So bright, Darrow groaned and covered his eyes with his hands. It happened in absolute silence. A wide, undulating hemisphere of fire formed on the flat roof of the vehicle. The sun became a pale blur. Everything blurred. Before Pike could scream, the radio equipment crackled, as if something were crushing it from within. A lightning bolt jumped from the panel. Acidic vapors erupted from the casing. Small flames licked the insulation. Darrow's kick came just in time. He cut the connection to the reactor. Darrow's hand struck Pike's helmet a second later. Fresh oxygen entered the big man's lungs, and the scream caught in his throat. Vince Darrow sat still in his seat, as if the entire world had passed by without touching him. The green glare disappeared as quickly as it had come. Not a flicker remained. Only the melted antenna, like wax, and the smoldering transmitter said something had happened. Something that didn't fit any manual. Pike looked around for an enemy that wasn't there. No cannons, no figures, just vacuum. The hiss of the dry foam extinguisher made him jump. Darrow was putting out the fire with a calm that set his nerves on edge. Pike began to curse. Low, constant, like a prayer in reverse. The fire went out. The conditioner swallowed the vapors. Fresh oxygen entered. They had lost several precious liters. Darrow opened his helmet. He looked upward with an expression carved from ice. "It's over," he said, and his voice vibrated like a string about to snap. They were just waiting for this. "Holy God, what was that?" whispered Pike, sinking into the seat. "A very funny way of telling us to shut up. Don't ask me how they did it. I'm as lost as you are. I only know the glare appeared with my first word. That means they had an automatic radio goniometer watching for us. It activated instantly." Pike swallowed a concentrated tablet. His eyes had hardened, the engineer awakening under the skin. "Are you okay, at least? I always took you for the star pupil of the academy." "Not today," said Darrow, and a bitter smile twisted his mouth. "Not today. You just spoke like a cheap comic book. A fully automatic radiogoniometer? Do you realize what that implies? We were working with a directed beam, Pike. How the hell did they track the impulse so fast?" The antenna was pointing into the void. "But that's the least of it. Do you have any idea of the energies they handled for that green glare?" "Don't make me answer, or I'll sound raving mad." "We were under a force field," Pike insisted. "I saw it clearly. A green finger came down from there, and goodbye antenna. Vince, I swear that doesn't exist. I could swallow anything. Directed discharges, whatever. But this is beyond me." Darrow didn't move. His eyes burned. "Then we dreamed it," he said, and it sounded as if he were speaking from far away. "My head also reached its limit. Someone heard my transmission instantly and acted instantly. The how, I don't give a damn about right now. I don't understand it with what I know. What's important is that someone wants us trapped here. I'd bet my life they wouldn't let us take off a single kilometer with the STAR Comet. Don't ask. I feel it in my bones." Pike turned even paler. "You're the coldest son of a—" He swallowed. "Nothing else? I just acknowledge what needs to be done. Unanswered questions, I park. We don't waste time on them." Pike nodded weakly. Color returned to his cheeks. "Okay, head in the sand." He laughed without humor. "Though I don't understand anything anymore. If it didn't seem like absolute madness, I'd say it was a force field. But how do you raise a force field in a vacuum? Without poles, without anything? Who wants to erase us from the map? And with what? The Asian rocket that launched before us?" Darrow suggested, watching Pike closely. Pike smiled. His heavy hands hung between his knees as if they were no longer any use. "Forget the stories, old man. Neither you nor I believe it. I don't care about anything anymore. I'd swallow a rusty nail if the Chinese have something like that. It was overwhelming. Okay, I'll shut up. Plan?" Darrow smiled in that special way, the one Pike knew as alarm level 1. "Go, look, and don't let our guard down for a second. Don't let them catch us off guard. I don't see another way. If we stay put, we suffocate in a few weeks. If we launch, they shoot us down. That's simple." "Negotiate?" Pike asked without much conviction. "I'd love to. The question is whether those people negotiate. What happened doesn't invite coffee. Why didn't they let us talk? Humanity already knows we landed. Cutting us off like that is pointless, reckless. If they'd wanted to kill us, I'd understand. But this seems like the work of madmen. They want something more." Pike started whistling again, off-key and nervous. "In the end, they'll kill us anyway," he said. Slowly, when we run out of air, he fell silent. His forehead wrinkled. "Okay, Commander, I'll plot the new course. A short stroll through hell. 8 hours, and we're there." He swiveled his seat. Then came Darrow's retort. "First, we sleep 8 hours exactly. Then we shave properly. I don't want to look like savages." Pike looked at him as if he'd grown another head. "Shave? Did you say shave? The Asians don't have our strong beards. It might bother them," Darrow explained with a smile that chilled the blood. Max Pike felt a shiver that didn't come from the lunar cold. What the hell was the commander plotting? Just 30 kilometers beyond the pole, the infrared sensor beeped like a dog scenting blood. Something big, hot, alive, was down there. Right inside the red circle Chuck Gates had drawn on the map with a trembling hand the night before. They left the armored tank behind and continued on foot, climbing over rocks that looked like broken teeth of a buried giant. The annular wall rose over 600 meters, a black scar cutting the sky. A crater impossible to see from Earth. A secret the moon had jealously guarded until that day. Half an hour later, after navigating the last outcrop, the portable locator started screaming for real. They were on top of the other ship. And then, Max Pike fell apart. He buckled at the knees, as if his legs had been cut. He placed his gloved hands on the gray dust and let out a sound that wasn't a laugh, a broken noise that echoed inside his helmet and reached the intercom like an echo of madness. Vince Darrow didn't open his mouth. He crouched instinctively behind a rock, but soon felt his will falter. Just seeing it had been enough. That was the final blow for nerves already hanging by a thread. No, this isn't. Pike repeated over and over, like a scratched record. Darrow straightened up abruptly, his fists opened on their own. With more force than necessary, he pushed his friend under the cover of a boulder. Pike snapped out of it. Sweat fogged his visor. Darrow turned on his helmet fan. Pike needed it more than air. Calm down, don't lose your head now. Breathe. If they turn on that green light on our helmet antennas again, we're fried. Calm down, Max. Darrow also repeated the words like a cheap mantra, because sometimes the only thing that works is the monotonous sound, the cadence reminding you you're still human. He had prepared himself for something big, but knowing and seeing were two different beasts. They were no longer alone. They never had been. That certainty hit his chest like a cold fist. He felt as if he stood before a wall with no top. It took him a few more seconds, but his face closed off again. His heart stopped hammering like crazy, and his vision cleared. He didn't let go of Pike's arm. He knew his friend would take longer to come back. Carefully, he poked his helmet over the boulder. He looked, and no doubt remained. It wasn't a dream. It was a reality that crushed. He kept silent until Pike spoke on his own. "You knew," Pike whispered. "You've known for hours. That's why the shaving." "How did you know, Vince?" "Don't get upset, kid. Getting upset doesn't fix anything," Darrow replied, his voice hoarse, as if it hurt to speak. "That ship wasn't built with wood or earth steel. I suspected it with the green glare. No human generates a force field like that. Get a grip. We have to digest it. We have no other choice." Pike straightened up. The glassy veil left his eyes. He looked too. "Forced landing," he said after a while, as if reading a police report. "They took half the wall down with them, with a violence you don't even want to imagine. Who are they? What are they like? Where do they come from? And," he pressed his lips until they turned white, "what the hell do they want here?" The question fully woke Darrow. The coldness returned like a heavy blanket. "We'll find out," he said, drawing out the words like someone testing a knife's edge. "Now it all fits. Of course they had to cut our radio. They're not interested in Earth knowing they're here. They thought we would have seen them before landing. Suddenly, the puzzle makes sense, doesn't it?" And yes, it made sense. a cold, sharp sense that cut. They stayed quiet for a while, looking at the gigantic sphere resting at the bottom of the crater, like a moon fallen from the sky. The ripped hull, the molten rock around it, the twisted telescopic supports. Everything screamed accident, urgency, desperation. Darrow felt curiosity burning in his stomach like a shot of cheap whiskey. A commander with 2 brain cells doesn't land like that, he said quietly. They took half the mountain with them. That wasn't planned. They had a serious problem. That makes them human in some twisted way. He smiled without humor. And since it's always fallen to me to be the good loser, let's get a little closer. He stood up to his full height. The mocking smile Pike knew so well crossed his face. "You're crazy, get down," Pike hissed. "It's not madness. Look at our situation. We're not getting out of here. If Marcus Cobb sends another rocket, we'll be pushing up daisies, and the next crew will get the same treatment. There's nothing to think about. Even your thick skull might understand that." Curiosity roared in Darrow like an old engine that refuses to die. It was that eternal question that drives men to stick their heads where they shouldn't. What's behind the wall? Suddenly, someone laughed. It was brief, barely a puff of air, but someone laughed on their frequency. Pike jumped with his weapon ready. His face had turned the color of lunar dust. "You heard that too?" he whispered. "Someone's listening, damn it." "What did you expect?" A calm, serene voice answered inside their helmets. "Why do you think I've avoided long speeches? Of course they're listening. The fact they haven't fried our helmet transmitters means they're smart. They know with this, we can't even get to the corner. Crushing logic. Let's go." Pike stood frozen. The weapon hung slack in his hand. "Go if you want. I don't feel like smiling at intelligent squid or 3-headed bugs. I'll stay." Darrow's face hardened. "You've read too many cheap magazines, my friend. The idea that the alien must be monstrous is childish. Science doesn't think like that. There are brains on Earth who've said for years that other intelligences exist, and they don't imagine drooling monsters. So cut the stories and come. I'm not ordering you, but come." Darrow turned and stepped out of cover with long, measured strides, like a man walking to his own judgment. The automatic hung loose from the strap on his right shoulder, hands open at his sides. He wasn't gonna turn humanity's first contact into a shootout. That would be dirty, sad, miserable, unworthy of a man who prided himself on thinking clearly. The closer he got, the larger the sphere loomed, easily 500 meters in diameter. The landing legs were columns of alien steel with bases as wide as houses. He smiled to see that, in the end, they solved the same problems with similar solutions. He heard Pike's agitated breathing behind him. Then, the big man's shadow joined his. Pike said nothing. Darrow thanked him silently. They kept walking more slowly. Above them, the hemisphere eclipsed the sun. The shadow was deep, cold, absolute. "If they launch now, they'll turn us to dust," Darrow said calmly, pointing at the enormous nozzles of the equatorial ring. "Those are propulsion mouths. The ground is vitrified around them. I estimate 2 million tons at terrestrial launch. How do you lift something like that?" "I recommend a giant firecracker," Pike muttered, sarcastic, taking refuge in black humor because it was all he had left. Darrow sensed a war council was being held inside the ship. They would be disoriented too. They knew they could erase them from the mat with a button, and they hadn't. That was a foothold. They stopped right where the absolute darkness under the hull began. Darrow threw his head back until his neck hurt. Pike spoke loudly, with the voice a man uses when he no longer cares. Under your ship are two ferocious beasts, with hunger in their bellies and fear in their throats. Good day. I'm Max Pike. You had the kindness to force us to land nose first. We've come to present the bill. Silence. Darrow felt his throat dry up like paper. Pike's outburst was so absurd it almost worked. They didn't speak further. Darrow had to make an effort not to grab his weapon. Pike already had his gripped as if it were part of his body. Then came the glow. The same intense green as before, but this time soft, almost gentle. Darrow flinched. Against his will, the automatic slid into the crook of his arm. His mouth hardened. Trembling inside, he slung it over his shoulder. First contact had just begun. Get rid of that thing, now, Darrow hissed through clenched teeth, not taking his eyes off the white opening that had just appeared in the curved wall. I've told you 3 times. The automatic lowered slowly, as if it weighed a ton, and hung loose from the strap again. Pike let out the breath he'd been holding for minutes. Something like a tongue of solid light emerged from the opening. It touched the ground noiselessly and unfolded into a wide, smooth, slightly glowing ramp. It stayed there, still, inviting. The invitation, Darrow said, his voice tense, almost amused. No steps. The hatch is 90 meters up. The whole STAR Comet could fit in here. A little intelligence test, perhaps, Pike muttered, nervous, looking up again and again, without seeing anyone. Darrow put a foot on the ramp. The angle was 45 degrees, but he felt no incline. His shoes floated a couple of millimeters above the fluorescent material, and he began to ascend, as if an invisible hand were gently pushing him upward. He instinctively extended his arms, seeking balance where none was needed. Pike let out a long, creative curse. He followed on all fours, grabbing at the air, as if he might fall backward. They were deposited gently into a vast chamber, bathed in white light. The doors closed behind them, without a whisper. The silence was so dense it hurt. No one will believe us, Pike whispered. No one. And we still don't know if we'll ever speak to anyone again. Negotiate, Max, Darrow said quietly. Try, use, see what we can get. It all boils down to that. Turn off the instincts for a while and look with a cold head. A soft hiss filled the chamber. Fresh, warm air entered. The first real sounds after days of absolute vacuum. Darrow smelled something metallic, slightly sweet, but breathable. Then the voice came, clear, with a perfect Oxford professor's accent. You may open your suits. The air is compatible with your metabolism. Darrow undid his helmet seal, without hesitation. Pike imitated him a second later, with hands that still trembled. The heat was stifling. The bluish, almost ultraviolet light hurt his eyes. The hall was immense, walls covered with screens either dark or blinking faintly, as if the entire ship were half asleep. And there was Krill, tall, much taller than Darrow, slender to the point of seeming fragile. Taut, youthful skin, but the face of a very old man who has seen too much. High, domed forehead, large eyes of a reddish ivory that looked through him with an intensity that pierced. His hair was almost non-existent, just a silver veil. He wore a loose tunic of a material that shifted hues with the light. He moved slowly, as if each gesture cost him enormous effort. He looked sick, very sick. Beside him, two Teclarians lay on low bulks, watching oval screens where hypnotic geometric figures formed, changing color endlessly. They didn't look up when the humans entered. Not a blink. It was as if Darrow and Pike were furniture. A heavy, almost palpable drowsiness hung in the air. Those beings were absent, lost in their own dreams. Then Kyla entered. Darrow felt something tighten in his chest. She was as tall as him, perhaps a bit more. The same skin tone, the same reddish eyes. But in her, everything was sharpness. The narrow, perfect face, cold as winter lake ice. The white silver hair pulled into a severe bun. The form-fitting clothing, black with red symbols that glowed faintly on her chest. Rank, authority, contempt. She glanced at them once, like someone brushing off a bothersome fly. She said nothing. None was needed. The message was crystal clear. They weren't worth the dust on her boots. Darrow felt the blood drain from his face. Never, not in the toughest academy interrogations, not facing generals who looked at him like an insect, had he felt such pure, absolute, indifferent contempt. Pike opened his mouth and closed it without a sound. Krill spoke then, with that cultured, kindly, almost sad voice. May I present Kyla, commander of this ship. I am Krill, chief scientist of the expedition. The English was impeccable, accentless, as if he'd been born speaking it. Darrow inclined his head slightly. It wasn't reverence. It was acknowledgement that he stood before someone who, despite his weakness, still retained dignity. Major Vince Darrow, United States Space Force. This is Captain Max Pike. We represent humanity, or at least the part that arrived first. Krill smiled with ancient sadness. You arrived just in time, he said, and perhaps too late for us. Kyla took a step forward. Her voice was pure ice. They are primitives. They should not be here, but fate has a cruel sense of humor. Darrow didn't look away. He felt Pike stiffen beside him. Primitive or not, he replied calmly, we are here, and your ship is broken.